Microphone. Hello. Welcome back. It's been a little while as got occupied with other things and didn't get to the reading as soon as I'd like. But we are back. We are now on Book 8. Quick recap of what Book 7 was about. They were talking about the education that one should have. Sort of they have a philosophic nature and how these sorts of people should be nurtured. They also talked about the allegory of the cave, this sort of metaphor for philosophical enlightenment and contemplating the intelligible things and not the mere beliefs about things, but the truth of what they actually are and stuff like that. Good fun. Good fun. And they even had a bit where sort of those who are to be the worthy ones will they won't get to just simply enjoy their enlightenment. They will have to go back and uplift the others, which I thought was quite interesting. But let's head here and here and here, like so. There we go. And let's see what Book 8 is about. Ooh, feeling a bit low energy today, so hopefully I'll be alright. Let's have a look. So this goes from 1155 to... Oh, only to here? Oh, wait, no, that's the right one, yeah. Book 8, let's see. Where does it go up to? It goes up to 1180, so that is about 30 pages again. Or 25, average size. Alright, let's see what it's about. And I'll read the last paragraph of the previous book, so we remind ourselves of our train of thought. They'll send everyone in the city who is over 10 years old into the country. Then they'll take possession of the children, who are now free from the ethos of their parents, and bring them up in the customs and laws, which are the ones we've described. This is the quickest and easiest way for the city and constitution we've discussed to be established, to become happy, and to bring the most benefit to the people among whom is established. That's by far the quickest. My fan blew the page. I'm going to turn my fan up. It's not particularly hot, it's just it's blowing the pages. Okay. Where was I? That's by far the quickest and easiest way. And in my opinion, Socrates, you've described, well, how it would come into being, if it ever did. Then isn't this enough about this city, and the man who is like it? Surely it is clear what sort of man we'll say he has to be. It is clear, he said. And as for your question, I think we have reached the end of this topic. That's the end of Book 7, that now beginning the start of Book 8. Alright. Well then, Glaucon. We've agreed to the following. If a city is to achieve the height of good government, wives must be in common, children and all their education must be in common, their way of life, whether in peace or war, must be in common, and their kings must be those among them who have proved to be the best, both in philosophy and in warfare. We have agreed to that, he said. Moreover, we have also agreed that, as soon as the rulers are established, they will lead the soldiers and settle them in the kind of dwellings we have described, which are in no way private, but common to all. And we also agreed, if you remember, what kind of possessions they will have. I remember that we thought none of them should acquire any of the things that other rulers now do, but that, as athletes in war and guardians, they should receive their yearly upkeep from the other citizens as a wage for their guardianship, and look after themselves and the rest of the city. That's right. But since we have completed this discussion, let's recall the point at which we began the discussion, the digression that brought us here, so that we can continue on the same path from where we left off. That isn't difficult, for much the same as now, you were talking as if you had completed the description of the city. You said that you would class both the city you described and the man who is like it as good, even though, as it seems, you had a still finer city and man to tell us about. But in any case, you said that if this city was the right one, the others were faulty. You said, if I remember, that there were 4 types of constitution remaining that are worth discussing, each with faults that we should observe, and we should do the same for the people who are like them. Our aim was to observe them all, agree which man is best and which is worst, and then determine whether the best is happiest, and whether the worst is most wretched, or whether it's the otherwise. I was asking you which 4 constitutions you had in mind when Polemarchus and Adamantus interrupted. And that's when you took up the discussion that led here. That's absolutely right. Well then, like a wrestler, give me the same hold again, and when I ask the same question, try to give the answer you were about to give before. If I can. I'd at least like to hear what 4 constitutions you meant. That won't be difficult, since they're the ones for which we have names. First, there's the constitution praised by most people, namely the Cretan or Laconian, that is, the Spartan constitution. Second, which is also second in the praise it receives, is called oligarchy, and is filled with a host of evils. The next in order, and antagonistic to it, is democracy. And finally, there is genuine tyranny, surpassing all of them. And fourth, and last of the diseased cities, surpassing all of them, the fourth and last of the diseased cities. Or can you think of another type of constitution? I mean another whose form is distinct from these. Dynasties and purchased kingships, and other constitutions of that sort, which one finds no less among the barbarians than among the Greeks, are somewhere intermediate between these 4. At any event, many strange ones are indeed talked about. And do you realise that, of necessity, there are as many forms of human character as there are of constitutions? Or do you think that constitutions are born from oak or rock, and not from the characters or the people who live in the cities governed by them, which tip the scales, so to speak, and drag the rest along them? No, I don't believe they come from anywhere else. Then, if there are 5 forms of city, there must also be 5 forms of individual soul. Of course. Now, we've already described the one that's like aristocracy, which is rightly said to be good and just. Side note here, the etymology of aristocracy comes from the word aristos, sort of meaning the best. It's sort of supposed to be rule by the best. Of course, in our modern day, we hear the word aristocracy, and they seem to be quite debauched and useless people who just have a lot of status, but aren't actually the best. But I assume this is what he's talking about. I assume he's talking about rule by the best, which is rightly said to be good and just. We have. Then mustn't we go through the inferior ones? Namely, the victory-loving and honour-loving, which corresponds to the Laconian form of constitutions. Followed by the oligarchic and democratic and the tyrannical. So that, having discovered the most unjust of all, we can oppose him to the most just. In this way we can complete our investigation into how pure justice and pure injustice stand, with regard to the happiness and wretchedness of those who possess them. And either be persuaded by Thrasymachus to practice injustice, or by argument, that is, now coming to light, to practice justice. Also, side note, Laconian refers to the Lacedaemonians, who are the Spartans. They're also pronounced sort of with a more modern pronunciation of Laconic, or Laconic. It's a C. but they are speaking of the Spartans. That's absolutely what we have to do. Then, just as we began by looking for the virtues of character in a constitution, before looking for them in the individual, thinking that they'd be clearer in the former, shouldn't we first examine the honour-loving constitution? I don't know what other name there is for it, but it should be called either timocracy or timarchy. Then, shouldn't we examine an individual who is related to that constitution? And after that, oligarchy and an oligarchic person, and democracy and a democratic person. And finally, having come to a city under a tyrant, and having examined it, shouldn't we look into a tyrannical soul? Trying in this way to become adequate judges of the topic we've proposed to ourselves. That would be a reasonable way for us to go about observing and judging, at any rate. Well then, let's try to explain how timocracy emerges from aristocracy. I want to quickly look up the etymology of timos here. Let's see. See, I know in Latin it sort of means fear, but that doesn't sound quite right. I assume they're using a Greek word here. Ah, okay, they're using time, meaning honour and worth. That's what they mean by timocracy. Sort of a rule of the honourable. Here's a funny trivia. The way the sort of voting worked in Sparta, at least according to Plutarch, was such that the one who shouted loudest, the loudest group, was the one who got the vote. So they wouldn't count. They wouldn't count. It was only which group shouted the loudest. Sort of you get an idea of what sort of society they were. It was that sort of very sort of, I don't want to use the word barbaric, but sort of barbaric culture where it's about the strongest warrior being the best and the most honoured. Where was I? Well then, let's try to explain how timocracy emerges from aristocracy. Or is it a simple principle that the cause of change in any constitution is civil war breaking out within the ruling group itself, but that if this group, however, small it is, remains of one mind, the constitution cannot be changed? Yes, that's right. How then, Glaucon, will our city be changed? How will civil war arise, either between auxiliaries and the rulers, or within either group? Or do you want us to be like Homer and pray to the muses to tell us how civil war first broke out? And shall we say that they speak to us in tragic tones, as if they were earnest, playing and jesting with us as if we were children? What will they say? Something like this. It is hard for a city composed in this way to change, but everything that comes into being must decay. Not even a constitution such as this will last forever. It too must face dissolution, and this is how it will be dissolved. All plants that grow in the earth, and all the animals that grow upon it, have periods of fruitfulness and barrenness, of both body and soul, as often as the revolutions complete the circumference of their circles. These circumferences are short for the short-lived, and the opposite for their opposites. Now, the people you have educated to be leaders in your city, even though they are wise, still won't, through calculation together with sense perception, hit upon the fertility and barrenness of the human species, but it will escape them, and so they will, at some point, beget children when they ought not to. For the birth of a divine creature, there is a cycle comprehended by a perfect number. For a human being, it is the first number in which they are found root and square increases, comprehending 3 lengths and 4 terms of elements that make things like and unlike, that causes them to increase and decrease, and that render all things mutually agreeable and rational in their relations to one another. Of these elements, 4 and 3, married with 5, give 2 harmony when thrice increased. One of them is a square, so many times 100, the other is of equal length, one way but oblong. One of its sides is 100 squares of the rational diameter of 5 diminished by 1, or 100 squares of the irrational diameter diminished by 2 each. The other side is 100 cubes of 3. This whole geometrical number controls better or worse births. And when your rulers, through ignorance of these births, join brides and grooms at the wrong time, the children will be neither good-natured, nor fortunate. You can't hear. I'm pretty sure I have audio. I hope I have audio. But, there's not much to look here if you can't hear. And I guess he can't hear me if he can't hear. But, no, I know this audio. It must be, Charlie Folds is, muted. I don't know. There's a side note here, which I'm probably not going to read in its entirety, of explaining what this long mathematical sounding thing was just talking about. Is about the human geometrical number, sort of a product of 3, 4, and 5, multiplied by itself 3 times. It's a strange. This seems like nonsense to me. There's some sort of geometry here. 100 cubes of 3. I don't know what he's on about here. This seems like some madness, so we'll go past that. The older generation will choose the best of these children, but they are unworthy nevertheless. And when they acquire their father's powers, they will begin, as guardians, to neglect us muses. First, they will have less consideration for music and poetry than they ought. Then they will neglect physical training, so that your young people will become less well-educated. Music and poetry. Hence, rulers chosen from among them won't be able to guard well the testing of the gold and silver and bronze and iron races, which are Hesiod's and your own. The intermixing of iron with silver and bronze with gold, the results will engender lack of likeness and unharmonious inequality. And these always breed war and hostility wherever they arise. Civil war, we declare, is always and everywhere of this lineage. And we'll declare that what the Muses say is right. It must be, since they're the Muses. What do the Muses say after that? Once civil war breaks out, both the iron and bronze types pull the constitution towards money-making and the acquisition of land, houses, gold, and silver, while both the gold and silver types, not being poor but by nature rich, or rich in their souls, lead the constitution towards virtue and the old order. And thus, the striving and struggling with one another, they compromise on a middle way. They distribute the land and houses as private property, enslave and hold as serfs and servants those whom they previously guarded as free friends and providers of upkeep, and occupy themselves with war and with guarding against those whom they've enslaved. I think this is the way that transformation begins. Then, isn't this, the Constitution, a sort of midpoint between aristocracy and oligarchy? Absolutely. Then, if that's its place in the transformation, how will it be managed after the change? Isn't it obvious that it will imitate the aristocratic constitution in some respects, and oligarchy in others, since it's in between them, and that it will also have some features of its own? That's right. The rulers will be respected. The fighting class will be prevented from taking part in farming, manual labour, and other ways of making money. It will eat communally, and devote itself to physical training, and training for war. And in all such cases, won't the constitution be like the aristocratic one? Yes. On the other hand, it will be afraid to appoint wise people as rulers, on the grounds that they are no longer simple and earnest, but mixed, and will incline towards spirited and simpler people who are more naturally suited for war than peace. It will value the tricks and stratagems of war and spend all its time making war. Aren't most of these qualities peculiar to it? Yes. Such people will desire money, just as those in oligarchies do, passionately adoring gold and silver in secret. They will possess private treasuries and storehouses where they can keep it hidden, and have houses to enclose them, like private nests, where they can spend lavishly either on women or anyone else they wish. That's absolutely true. They'll be mean with their own money, since they value it, and are not allowed to acquire it openly, but they'll love to spend other people's because of their appetites. They'll enjoy the pleasures in secret, running away from the law like boys from their father, for since they've neglected the true muse, that of discussion and philosophy, and have valued physical training more than music and poetry, they haven't been educated by persuasion, but by force. The constitution you're discussing is certainly a mixture of good and bad. Yes, it is mixed. But because of the predominance of the spirited element, one thing alone is most manifest in it, namely, the love of victory and the love of honour. Very much so. This is the way this constitution would come into being. What it would be like, for, after all, we're only sketching the shape of the constitution in theory, not giving it an exact account of it, since even from a sketch we'll be able to discern the most just and the most unjust person. And besides, it would be an intolerably long task to describe every constitution and every character without omitting any detail. That's right. Then who is the man that corresponds to this constitution? How does he come into be? And what sort of man is he? I think, said Adamantus, that he'd be very much like Glaucon here, as far as the love of victory is concerned. In that respect, I said, he might be, but in the following one, I don't think his nature would be similar. Which ones do you mean? He'd be more obstinate and less well trained in music and poetry, though he's a lover of it, and he loved to listen to speeches and arguments, though he's by no means a rhetorician, someone who practices rhetoric. He'd be harsh to his slaves, rather than merely looking down on them as an adequately educated person does. He'd be gentle to free people and very obedient to rulers, being himself a lover of ruling and a lover of honour. However, he doesn't base his claim to rule on his ability as a speaker, or anything like that, but as he's a lover of physical training and a lover of hunting, on his abilities and exploits in warfare and warlike activities. Glaucon as a proper noun. Glaucon's a name. Glaucon is a proper noun. He is a proper name. He is an individual in this group who is listening to Socrates' speeches. I'm not actually familiar with what Glaucon is as a verb or a noun. What is a Glaucon? Or what is to Glaucon? I've never heard that word before. I only know it as the man called Glaucon. Yes, that's the character that corresponds to this constitution. Wouldn't such a person despise money when he's young, but love it more and more as he grows older, because he shares in the money-loving nature and isn't pure in his attitude towards virtue? And there's a mark on my book here. How did that get there? There shouldn't be a mark on my book. I bought this book brand new. Oh. I think that's a defect in the paper. Ah. Yes, who's getting dirt on my Plato book? Wouldn't such a person despise money when he's young, but love it more and more as he grows older, because he shares in the money-loving nature, and isn't pure in his attitude towards virtue? And isn't that because he lacks the best of guardians? What guardian is that? Adamantus said. Reason, I said, mixed with music and poetry, for it alone dwells within the person who possesses it as the lifelong preserver of virtue. Well put. That, then, is the timocratic youth. He resembles the corresponding city, the Lacedaemonians. Absolutely. And he comes into being in some such way as this. He is the son of a good father who lives in a city that isn't well governed, who avoids honours, office, lawsuits, and all such meddling in other people's affairs, and who is even willing to be put at a disadvantage in order to avoid trouble. Then how does he come to be timocratic? When he listens first to his mother complaining that her husband isn't one of the rulers, and that she's had a disadvantage among the other women as a result. Then she sees that he's not very well concerned about money, and that he doesn't fight back when he's insulted, whether in private or in public in the courts, but is indifferent to everything of that sort. She also sees him concentrating his mind on his own thoughts, neither honouring nor dishonouring her overmuch. Angered by all of this, she tells her son that his father is unmanly, too easygoing, and all the other things that women repeat over and over again in such cases. Yes, Adamantus said. It's like them to have so many such complaints. You know, too, I said, that the servants of men like that, the ones who are thought to be well disposed to the family, also say similar things to the son in private. When they see the father failing to prosecute someone who owes him money, or has wronged him in some other way, they urge the son to take revenge on all such people when he grows up, and to be more of a man than his father. The boy hears and sees the same kind of things when he goes out. Those in the city who do their own work are called fools, and held to be of little account, while those who meddle in other people's affairs are honoured and praised. The young man hears and sees all of this, but he also listens to what his father says, observes what he does from close at hand, and compares his way of living with those of the others. And so he's pulled by both. His father nourishes the rational part of his soul and makes it grow, and the other nourishes the spirited part and appetitive part. Because he isn't a bad man by nature, but keeps bad company, when he's pulled in these two ways, he settles in the middle, and surrenders the rule over himself to the middle part. The victory-loving and the spirited part becomes a proud, honour-loving man. I certainly think you've given a full account of how this sort of man comes to be. Side note here, is Plato saying this is a bad thing? Because I think this is a good thing. You neither want to become a troublemaker, but you also don't want to become a doormat. It's good to be, you've got to be in between. You've got to be able to stand up for yourself in a reasonable manner. Not be a brute, but don't be a doormat. Then we now have the second constitution, and the second man. We have. Then, shall we talk next, as Aeschylus says, of another man ordered like another city? Or shall we follow our plan, and talk about the city first? We must follow our plan. And I suppose that the one that comes after the present constitution is oligarchy, the rule of the rich. And what kind of constitution would you call oligarchy? The constitution based on property assessments, in which the rich rule, and the poor man has no share in the ruling. I understand. So mustn't we first explain how a timarchy is transformed into an oligarchy? Absolutely. Side note here, why does he assume that a timarchy has to transform into an oligarchy? Can an oligarchy not be formed out of many other forms of democracy? Forms of constitution, I mean? Is he assuming a sequence of events as being the only way it can go? But, I digress. Yes. And surely the manner of this transformation is clear even to the blind. What is it like? The treasure house filled with gold, which each possesses, destroys the constitution. First they find ways of spending money for themselves, and then they stretch the laws relating to this. Then they and their wives disobey the laws altogether, They would do that. And as one person sees another doing this and emulates him, they make the majority of the others like themselves. They do. From there, they proceed further into money-making, and the more they value it, the less they value virtue. Or aren't virtue and wealth so opposed that if they were set on scales, they'd always incline in opposite directions? That's certainly right. And so, when wealth and the wealthy are valued and honoured in a city, virtue and good people are valued less. Clearly. And what is valued is always practiced, and what isn't valued is neglected. That's right. Then, in the end, victory-loving and honour-loving men become lovers of making money, or money lovers, and they praise and admire wealthy people and appoint them as rulers, while they dishonour poor people. Certainly. Then, don't they pass a law that is characteristic of an oligarchic constitution? One that establishes a wealth qualification, higher where the constitution is more oligarchic, less where it's less so, and proclaims that those whose property doesn't reach the stated amount aren't qualified to rule. And they either put this through by force of arms, or else, before it comes to it, they terrorise the people and establish their constitution that way. Of course it is. Generally speaking, then, that's the way this kind of constitution is established. Yes, but what is its character? And what are the faults that we said it contained? First of all, the very thing that defines it is one. For what would happen if someone were to choose the captains of their ship by their wealth, refusing to entrust the ship to a poor person, even if he was a better captain? They would make a very poor voyage of it. And isn't the same true of the rule of anything else whatsoever? I suppose so. Except a city, or does it also apply to a city? Or to a city most of all, since it's the most difficult and the most important kind of rule. That, then, is one major fault of oligarchy. Apparently. And what about this second fault? Or is it any smaller than the other? Which fault do you mean? That of necessity. It isn't one city, but two. One of the poor and one of the rich, living in the same place and always plotting against one another. Oh, by God, that's just as big a fault as the first. And the following is hardly a fine quality either. Namely, that oligarchs probably aren't able to fight a war, for they'd be compelled to either arm and use the majority, and so have more to fear from them than the enemy, or not to use them, and show up as true oligarchs, few in number on the battlefield. At the same time, they'd be unwilling to pay mercenaries, because of their love of money. That certainly isn't a fine quality either. And what about the meddling in other people's affairs, that we condemned before? Under this constitution, won't the same people be farmers, moneymakers, and soldiers simultaneously? Or do you think it's right for things to be that way? Oh no, not at all. Now let's see whether this constitution is the first to admit the greatest of all evils. Which one is that? Allowing someone to sell all his possessions and someone else to buy them, and then allowing the one who has sold them to go on living in the city while belonging to none of its parts, for he's neither a moneymaker, a craftsman, a member of the cavalry, or a hoplite, but a poor person without means. It is the first to allow that. At any rate, this sort of thing is not forbidden in oligarchies. If it were, some of their citizens wouldn't be excessively rich, while others are totally impoverished. That's right. Now, think about this. When the person who sells all of his possessions was rich, and spending his money, was he of any greater use to the city, in the ways we've just mentioned, than when he had spent it all? Or did he merely seem to be one of the rulers of the city, while in truth he was neither ruler nor subject there, but only a squanderer of his property? That's right. He seemed to be part of the city, but he was nothing but a squanderer. Should we say, then, that as a drone exists in a cell and is an affliction to the hive, so this person is a drone in the house and an affliction to the city? That's certainly right, Socrates. Hasn't the god made all the winged drones stingless, Adamantus? As well as some wingless ones, while other wingless ones have dangerous stings. And don't the stingless ones continue as beggars into old age, while those with stings become what we call evildoers? Oh, that's absolutely true. Clearly, then, in any city, where you see beggars, there are thieves, pickpockets, temple robbers, and all such evildoers hidden. That is clear. What about oligarchic cities? Don't you see beggars in them? Almost every one, except the ruler, is a beggar there. Sorry, I read that wrong. Almost everyone except the rulers is a beggar there. Then mustn't we suppose that they also include many evildoers with stings, whom the rulers carefully keep in check by force? We certainly must. And shall we say that the presence of such people is the result of lack of education, bad rearing, and a bad constitutional arrangement? We shall. This, then, or something like it, is the oligarchic city. It contains all these evils, and probably others in addition. That's pretty well what it's like. Then let's take it that we've disposed of the constitution called oligarchy. I mean the one that gets its ruler on the basis of property assessment. And let's examine the man who is like it, both how he comes to be and what sort of man he is. All right. Doesn't the transformation from the timocrat we've described to an oligarch occur mostly in this way? Which way? The timocrat's son at first emulates his father and follows in his footsteps. Then he suddenly sees him crashing against the city like a ship against a reef, spilling out all his possessions, even his life. He has held a generalship or some other high office, was brought to court by false witness, and was either put to death or exiled, or was disenfranchised and had all his property confiscated. That's likely. The son sees all of this, suffers from it, loses his property, and, fearing for his life, immediately drives from the throne in his own soul the honour-loving and spirited part that ruled there. Humbled by poverty, he turns greedily to making money, and, little by little, saving and working, he amasses property. Don't you think that this person would establish his appetite and money-making part on the throne, setting it up as a great king within himself, adorning it with golden tiaras and collars, and girding it with Persian souls? I do. He makes the rational and spirited parts sit on the ground beneath appetite, one on either side, reducing them to slaves. He won't allow first to reason about or examine anything except how a little money can be made into great wealth. And he won't allow the second to value or admire anything but wealth and wealthy people, or to have any ambition other than the acquisition of wealth, or whatever might contribute to getting it. There's no other transformation of a young man who is an honour lover into one who is a money lover that's as swift and as sure as this. Then isn't this an oligarchic man? Surely he developed out of a man who resembled the constitution from which oligarchy came. Then let's consider whether he resembles the oligarchic constitution. All right. Doesn't he resemble it in the first place by attaching the greatest importance to money? Of course. And, further, by being a thrifty worker who satisfies only his necessary appetites, makes no other expenditures, enslaves his other desires as vain. That's right. A somewhat squalid fellow who makes a profit from everything and hoards it, the sort the majority admires. Isn't this the man who resembles such a constitution? That's my opinion anyway. At any rate, money is valued above everything by both the city and the man. I don't suppose that such a man pays any attention to education. Oh, not in my view, for if he did, he wouldn't have chosen a blind leader for his chorus, and honoured him most. Speaking of Plutus, the god of wealth, who is blind, we have similar such gods for justice these days. Good, but consider this. Won't we say that, because of his lack of education, the dronish appetites, some beggarly and others evil, exist within him, but they're forcibly held in check by his carefulness? Certainly. Do you know where you should look to see the evil doings of such people? Where? To the guardianship of orphans, or something like that, where they have ample justice, ample opportunity to do injustice with impunity. That's true. And doesn't this make it clear that in those other contractual obligations where he has a good reputation and is thought to be just, he's forcibly holding his other evil appetites in check, by means of some decent part of himself. He holds them in check, not by persuading them that it's better not to act like them, or taming them with arguments, but by compulsion and fear, trembling for his other possessions. That's right. And by God, you'll find that most of them have appetites akin to those of the drone, once they have other people's money to spend. You certainly will. Then, someone like that won't be entirely free from internal civil war, and won't be one, but in some way too, though generally his better desires are in control of the worse. That's right. For this reason, he'd be more respectable than many, but the true virtue of a single-minded and harmonious soul far escapes him. I suppose so. Further, this thrifty man is a poor individual contestant for victory in a city, or any other fine and much-honoured thing, for he's not willing to spend money for the sake of a fine reputation, or on contests for such things. He's afraid to arouse his appetites for spending, or to call on them as allies to obtain victory, and so he fights like an oligarch with only a few of his resources. Hence, he's mostly defeated, but remains rich. That's right. Then have we any further doubt that a thrifty moneymaker is like an oligarchic city? Not at all. It seems then that we must next consider democracy, how it comes into being, and what character it has when it does, so that, knowing in turn the character of a man who resembles it, we can present him for judgment. That would be most consistent with what we've been doing. Well, isn't the city changed from an oligarchy to a democracy in some such way as this? Because of its insatiable desire to attain what it has set before itself as the good, namely the need to become as rich as possible. In what way? Since those who rule in the city do so because they own a lot, I suppose they're unwilling to enact laws to prevent young people who have had no discipline from spending and wasting their youth, so that, by making loans to them secured by the young people's property, and then calling those loans in, they themselves become even richer and more honoured. That's their favourite things to do. So isn't it clear by now that it is impossible for a city to honour wealth, and at the same time for its citizens to acquire moderation, but one or the other is inevitably neglected? That's pretty clear. Because of this neglect, and because they encourage bad discipline, oligarchies not infrequently reduce people of no common stamp to poverty. That's right. And these people sit idle in the city, I suppose, with their stings and weapons, some in debt, some disenfranchised, some both, hating those who have acquired their property, plotting against them, and others longing for a revolution. They certainly do. The money-makers, on the other hand, with their eyes on the ground, pretend not to see these people, and by lending money, they disable any of the remainder who resist, exact as interest many times the principal sum, and so create a considerable number of drones and beggars in the city. A considerable number indeed. In any case, they are unwilling to quench this kind of evil as it flares up in the city, either in the way we've mentioned by preventing people from doing whatever they like with their own property, or by another law, which would also solve the problem. Which law is that? The second best one, which compels citizens to care about virtue by prescribing that the majority of voluntary contracts be entered into at the lender's own risk, for lenders would be less shameless than in their pursuit of money in the city, and fewer of those evils we were mentioning just now would develop. Far fewer. But as it is, for all these reasons, the rulers in the city treat their subjects in the way we've described. But as for themselves and their children, don't they make their young fond of luxury, incapable of effort, either mental or physical, too soft to stand up to pleasures or pains, and idle besides? Of course. And don't they themselves neglect everything except making money, caring no more for virtue than the poor do? Yes. But when rulers and subjects in this condition meet on a journey or some other common undertaking, it might be a festival, an embassy, or a campaign, or they might be shipmates or fellow soldiers, and see one another in danger, in these circumstances, are the poor in any way despised by the rich? Or rather, isn't it often the case that a poor man, lean, suntanned, stands in battle next to a rich man, who's reared in the shade and carrying a lot of excess flesh, and sees him panting and at a loss? And don't you think that he'd consider that it's through the cowardice of the poor that such people are rich, and the one poor man would say to another, when they meet in private, "These people are at our mercy. They're good for nothing." I know very well that's what they do. Then, as a sick body needs only a slight shock from the outside to become ill, and is sometimes at civil war with itself, even without doing this, so a city in the same condition needs only a small pretext, such as one side bringing in allies from an oligarchy, or the other from a democracy, to fall ill and to fight with itself, and is sometimes in a state of civil war even without an external influence. Absolutely. And I suppose that democracy comes about when the poor are victorious, killing some of their opponents and expelling others, and giving the rest an equal share in ruling under the constitution, and, for the most part, assigning people to positions of rule by lot. Yes, that's how democracy is established, whether by force of arms, or because of those on the opposing side are frightened into exile. Then how do these people live? What sort of constitution do they have? It's clear that a man who is like it will be democratic. That is clear. First of all then, aren't they free? And isn't a city full of freedom and freedom of speech? Doesn't everyone in it have the license to do what he wants? Well, that's what they say at any rate. And where people have this license, it's clear that each of them will arrange his own life in whatever manner pleases him. It is. Then I suppose that it's most of all under this constitution that one finds people of all varieties. Of course. Then it looks as though this is the finest or most beautiful of the constitutions, for, like a coat embroidered with every kind of ornament, this city, embroidered with every kind of character type, would seem to be the most beautiful, and many people would probably judge it to be so, as women and children do when they see something multicoloured. They certainly do. It's also a convenient place to look for a constitution. Oh, why is that? Because it contains all kinds of constitutions on account of the license it gives to the citizens. So it looks as though anyone who wants to put a city in order, as we were doing, should probably go to a democracy, as to a supermarket of constitutions, pick out whatever pleases him, and establish that. He probably wouldn't be at a loss for models at any rate. In this city, there is no requirement to rule, even if you're capable of it, or, again, to be ruled if you don't want to be, or to be at war when the others are, or at peace unless you happen to want it, and there is no requirement in the least that you not serve in public office as a juror if you happen to want to serve, even if there is a law forbidding you to do so. Isn't that what a divine and pleasant life? Isn't that a divine and pleasant life while it lasts? It probably is, while it lasts. And what about the calm of some of their condemned criminals? Isn't that a sign of sophistication? Or have you never seen people who have been condemned to death under such a constitution stay on at the centre of things, strolling around like ghosts of dead heroes, without anyone staring them or giving them a thought? Yes, I've seen that a lot. And what about the city's tolerance? Isn't it so completely lacking in small-mindedness that it utterly despises the things we took seriously when we were founding our city? Namely that, unless someone had transcendental natural gifts, he'd never become good unless he played the right games and followed a fine way of life from early childhood. Isn't it magnificent the way it tramples all this underfoot by giving no thought to what someone was doing before he entered public life, and by honouring him only if he tells them that he wishes the majority well? Yes, it's altogether splendid. Then these, and the others like them, are the characteristics of democracy, and it would seem to be a pleasant constitution, which lacks rulers, but not variety, and which distributes a sort of equality to both equals and unequals alike. I certainly know what you mean. Consider, then, what private individuals resemble it. Or should we first inquire, as we did with the city, of how it comes to be? Oh, certainly we should do that. Well then, doesn't it happen like this? Wouldn't the son of that thrifty oligarch be brought up in his father's ways? Of course. Then he too rules his spendthrift pleasures by force, the ones that aren't money-making and are called unnecessary. Clearly. But so as to not discuss this in the dark, do you want us to first define which desires are necessary and which aren't? I do. Aren't those we can't desist from, and those whose satisfaction benefits us rightly, called necessary? For we are by nature compelled to satisfy them both. Isn't that so? Of course. So we'd be right to apply the term necessary to them. We would. What about those that someone could get rid of, if he practiced from youth on, those whose presence leads to no good, and even to its opposite? If we said that all of them were unnecessary, would we be all right? Would be, yeah. Need to drink some water. Would we be right? We would. Let's pick an example of each, so that we can grasp the patterns they exhibit. We should do that. Aren't the following desires necessary? The desire to eat to the point of health and well-being, and the desire for bread and delicacies. I suppose so. The desire for bread is necessary on both accounts. It's beneficial, and unless it's satisfied, we die. Yes. The desire for delicacies is also necessary, to the extent that it's beneficial to well-being. Absolutely. What about the desire that goes beyond these, and seeks other sorts of foods that most people can get rid of, if it's restrained and educated while they're young, and that's harmful both to the body and to the reason and moderation of the soul? Wouldn't it rightly be called unnecessary? Indeed it would. Then wouldn't we also say that such desires are spendthrift, while the earlier ones are money-making, because they profit our various projects? Certainly. And won't we say the same about the desire for sex and other desires? Yes. And didn't we say that the person we just now called a drone is full of such pleasures and desires, since he is ruled by unnecessary ones, while a thrifty oligarch is ruled by his necessary desires? We certainly did. Let's go back then, and explain how the democratic man develops out of the oligarchic one. It seems to me as though it mostly happens as follows. How? When a young man who is reared in the miserly and uneducated manner we described tastes the honey of the drones, and associated with wild and dangerous creatures who can provide every variety of multicoloured pleasure in every sort of way, this, as you might suppose, is the beginning of his transformation from having an oligarchic constitution within himself to having a democratic one. It's inevitable that this is how it starts. And just as the city changed when one party received help from like-minded people outside, doesn't the young man change when one party of his desires receives help from external desires that are akin to them and of the same form? Absolutely. And I suppose that If any contrary help comes from the oligarchic party within him, whether from his father or from the rest of his household, who extort and reproach him, then there's civil war and counter-revolution within him, and he battles against himself. That's right. Sometimes the Democratic Party yields to the oligarchic, and so that some of the young man's appetites are overcome. Others are expelled. A kind of shame rises in his soul, and order is restored. That does sometimes happen. But I suppose that, as desires are expelled, others akin to them are being nurtured unawares. And because of his father's ignorance about how to bring him up, they grow numerous and strong. That does tend to happen. These desires draw him back into the same bad company, and in secret intercourse breed a multitude of others. Certainly. And seeing the citadel of the young man's soul empty of knowledge, fine ways of living and words of truth, which are the best watchmen and guardians of thoughts of those men whom the gods love, they finally occupy the citadel itself. They certainly do. And in the presence of these guardians, false and boastful words and beliefs rush up and occupy this part of him. Indeed they do. Won't he then return to these lotus eaters and live with them openly? And if some help comes to the thrifty part of his soul from his household, won't these boastful words close the gates of the royal wall within him, to prevent these allies from entering, and refuse even to receive the words of older private individuals as ambassadors, doing battle and controlling things themselves, when they call reverence foolishness and moderation cowardice, abusing them and casting them out beyond the frontiers like disenfranchised exiles? And won't they persuade the young man that measured and orderly expenditure is boorish and mean, and joining with many useless desires, won't they expel it across the border? They certainly will. Having thus emptied and purged these from the soul of the one they've possessed, and initiated in splendid rites, they proceed to return insolence, anarchy, extravagance, and shamelessness from exile in a blaze of torchlight, wreathing them in garlands and accompanying them with a vast chorus of followers. They praise the returning exiles and give them fine names, calling insolence good breeding, anarchy freedom, extravagance magnificence, and shamelessness courage. Isn't it in some such way as this that someone who is young changes after being brought up with necessary desires to the liberation and release of useless and unnecessary pleasures? Yes, that's clearly the way it happens. And I suppose that after he spends as much money, effort, and time on unnecessary pleasures as on necessary ones, if he's lucky and his frenzy doesn't go too far, when he grows older and a great tumult within him has spent itself, he welcomes back some of the exiles, ceases to surrender himself completely to the newcomers, and puts his pleasure on equal footing. And so he lives, always surrendering rule over himself to whichever desire comes along, as if it were chosen by lot. And when that is satisfied, he surrenders the rule to another, not disdaining any, but satisfying them all equally. That's right. And he doesn't admit any word of truth into the guardhouse, for if someone tells him that some pleasures belong to the fine and good desires, and others to evil ones, and that he must pursue and value the former and restrain and enslave the latter, he denies all of this, and declares that all pleasures are equal and must be valued equally. Well, that's what someone in that condition would do. And so he lives on, yielding day by day to the desire at hand. Sometimes he drinks heavily while listening to the flute, at other times he drinks only water and on a diet. Sometimes he goes in for physical training, and other times he's idle and neglects everything. And sometimes he even occupies himself with what he takes to be philosophy. He often engages in politics, leaping up from his seat and saying and doing whatever comes to his mind. If he happens to admire soldiers, he's carried in that direction. If money-makers, in that one. There's neither order nor necessity in his life, but he calls it pleasant, free, and blessedly happy, and he follows it for as long as he lives. You've perfectly described the man who believes in legal equality. I suppose also that he's a complex man, full of all sorts of characters, fine and multicoloured, just like the democratic city, and that many men and women might envy his life, since it contains the most models of constitutions and ways of living. That's right. Then shall we set this man beside democracy, and one who is rightly called democratic? Let's do so. The finest constitution and the finest man remain for us to discuss. I think he's being ironic here. Namely, tyranny and a tyrannical man. They certainly do. Come then, how does tyranny come into being? It's fairly clear that it evolves from democracy. It is. It is? And doesn't it evolve from democracy in much the same way that democracy evolves from oligarchy? Oh, which way is that? The good that oligarchy puts before itself, and because of which it is established, is wealth, isn't it? Yes. And its insatiable desire for wealth and its neglect of other things, for the sake of money-making, is what destroyed it, isn't it? That's true. And isn't democracy's insatiable desire for what it defines as the good also what destroys it? What do you think it defines as the good? Freedom. Surely you hear a democratic say that this is the finest thing it has, so that, as a result, it is the only city worth living in for someone who is, by nature, free. Yes, you often hear that. Then, as I was about to say, doesn't the insatiable desire for freedom and the neglect of other things change this constitution and put it in need of a dictatorship? In what way? I suppose that when a democratic city, a thirst for freedom, happens to get bad cupbearers for its leader, so that it gets drunk by drinking more than it should of the unmixed wine of freedom, then, unless the rulers are very pliable and provide plenty of that freedom, they are punished by the city and accused of being accursed oligarchs. Yes, that is what it does. It insults those who obey the rulers as willing slaves and good-for-nothings, and praises and honours both in public and private rulers who behave like subjects, and subjects who behave like rulers. And isn't it inevitable that freedom should go to all lengths in such a city? Of course. It makes its way into private households, and in the end breeds anarchy, even among the animals. What do you mean? I mean that a father who accustoms himself to behave like a child and fear his sons, while the son behaves like a father, feeling neither shame nor fear in front of his parents, in order to be free, a resident alien or a foreign visitor is made equal to a citizen, and he is their equal. Yes, that's what happens. It does. And so do other little things of this same sort. A teacher in such a community is afraid of his students and flatters them, while the students despise their teachers. And, in general, the young imitate their elders and compete with them in word and deed, while the old stoop to the level of the young and are full of play and pleasantry, imitating the young for fear of appearing disagreeable and authoritarian. Absolutely. The utmost freedom for the majority is reached in such a city when bought slaves, both male and female, are no less free than those who bought them. And I almost forgot to mention the extent of legal equality of men and women, and of freedom of the relations between them. What about animals? Are we, with Aeschylus, going to say that whatever it was that came to our lips just now about them? Certainly. I put it this way. No one who hasn't experienced it would believe how much freer democratic animals are in a democratic city than anywhere else. As the proverb says, dogs become like their mistresses. Horses and donkeys are accustomed to roam freely and proudly along the streets, bumping into anyone who doesn't get out of their way, and all the rest are equally full of freedom. You're telling me what I already know. I've often experienced that sort of thing while travelling in the country. To sum up, do you notice how all these things together make the citizens' souls so sensitive that if anyone even puts upon himself the least degree of slavery, they become angry and cannot endure it, And in the end, as you know, they take no notice of the laws, whether written or unwritten, in order to avoid having any master at all. I certainly do. Then, this is the fine and impetuous origin from which tyranny seems to me to evolve. It certainly seems impetuous, but what comes next? The same disease that developed in oligarchy and destroyed it also develops here, but is more widespread and virulent because of the general permissiveness, and it eventually enslaves democracy. In fact, excessive action in one direction usually sets up a reaction in the opposite direction. This happens in seasons, in plants, in bodies, and, last but not least, in constitutions. That has to be expected. Extreme freedom can't be expected to lead to anything but a change to extreme slavery, whether for a private individual or for a city. No, it can't. Then I don't suppose that tyranny evolves from any constitution other than democracy, the most severe and cruel slavery from the most utmost freedom. Yes, that's reasonable. But I don't think this was your question. You asked what was the disease that developed in oligarchy and also in democracy, enslaving it. That's true. And what I had in mind as an answer was that the class of idle and extravagant men, whose bravest members are leaders, and the more cowardly ones, followers. We compared to them stinged and stingless drones, respectively. That's right. Now, these two groups cause problems in any constitution, just as phlegm and bile do in the body, and it's against them that the good doctor and lawgiver of a city must take advanced precautions, first, to prevent their presence, and second, to cut them out of the hive as quickly as possible, cells and all, if they should happen to be present. Yes, by God, he must cut them out altogether. Then let's take up the question in the following way, so that we can see what we want more clearly. In what way? Let's divide a democratic city into 3 parts in theory. This brings the way that it is, in fact, divided. This being the way that it is, in fact, divided. One part is the class of idlers, that grows here no less than in an oligarchy, because of the general permissiveness. So it does. But it is far fiercer in democracy than in the other. How so? In an oligarchy it is fear because it is disdained, but since it is prevented from having a share in ruling, it doesn't get any exercise, and doesn't become vigorous. In a democracy, however, with a few exceptions, this class, the idle one, is the dominant one. Its fiercest members do all the talking and acting, while the rest settle near the speaker's platform and buzz and refuse to tolerate the opposition of another speaker, so that, under a democratic constitution, with few exceptions, I referred to before, this class manages everything. That's right. Then there's the second class that always distinguishes itself from the majority of the people. Which is that? When everybody is trying to make money, those who are naturally most organised generally become the wealthiest. Probably so. Then they would provide the most honey for the drones, and the honey that is most easily extractable by them. Yes, for how else could anyone extract it from those who have very little? Then I suppose that these rich people are called drone fodder. Something like that. The people, those who work with their own hands, are the third class. They take no part in politics, and have very few possessions. But when they are assembled, they are the largest and most powerful class in a democracy. They are. But they aren't willing to assemble unless they get a share of the honey. And they always do get a share, though the leaders, in taking the wealth of the rich and distributing it to the people, keep the greater part for themselves. Yes, that is the way the people get their share. And I suppose that those whose wealth is taken away are compelled to defend themselves by speaking before the people and doing whatever else they can. Of course. And they're accused by the drones of plotting against the people and of being oligarchs, even if they have no desire for a revolution at all. That's right. So in the end, when they see the people trying to harm them, they truly do become oligarchs and embrace oligarchy's evil. whether they want to or not. But neither group does these things willingly. Rather, the people act as they do because they are ignorant and are deceived by the drones, and the rich act as they do because they are driven to it by the stinging of the same drones. Absolutely. And then there are impeachments, judgments, and trials on both sides. That's right. And aren't the people always in the habit of setting up one man as their special champion, nurturing him and making him great? They are. And it's clear that when a tyrant arises, this special leadership is the sole root from which he sprouts. It is. What is the beginning of the transformation from leader of the people to tyrant? Isn't it clear that it happens when the leader begins to behave like the man in the story told about the Lycaean Zeus in Arcadia? Zeus the wolf god. Which story is that? That anyone who tastes the one piece of human innards that's chopped up with those other sacrificial victims must inevitably become a wolf. Haven't you heard that story? Ah, yes, I've heard that story. Then doesn't the same happen with a leader of the people who dominates a docile mob and doesn't restrain himself from spilling kindred blood? He brings someone to trial on false charges and murders him, as tyrants often do, and thus, by blotting out a human life, his impious tongue and lips taste kindred citizen blood. He banishes some, kills others, and drops hints to the people about the cancellation of debts and the redistribution of land. And because of these things, isn't a man like that inevitably either to be killed by his enemies, or to be transformed from a man into a wolf by becoming a tyrant? It's completely inevitable. He's the one who stirs up civil wars against the rich. He is. And if he's exiled, but manages, despite his enemies, to return, doesn't he come back as a full-fledged tyrant? Clearly. And if these enemies are unable to expel him, or to put him to death by accusing him before the city, they plot secretly to kill him. That's usually what happens, at least. And all those who have reached this stage soon discover the famous request of the tyrant, namely that the people give him a bodyguard to keep their defender safe for them. That's right. And the people give it to him, I suppose because they are afraid for his safety, but aren't worried at all about their own. That's right. And when a wealthy man sees this, and is charged with being an enemy of the people because of his wealth, then, as the oracle to Croesus puts it, he flees to the banks of the many-pebbled Hermus, neither staying put nor being ashamed of his cowardice. He wouldn't get a second chance of being ashamed. That's true, for if he was caught, he'd be executed. He most certainly would. But as for the leader, he doesn't lie on the ground, mighty in his might, but, having brought down many others, he stands in the city's chariot, a complete tyrant, rather than a leader. What else? Then let's describe the happiness of this man, and of the city in which a mortal like him comes to be. Certainly, let's do so. During the first days of his reign, and for some time after, won't he smile in, welcome at anyone he meets, saying that he's no tyrant at all, making all sorts of promises both in public and in private, freeing the people from debt, redistributing the land to them and to his followers, and pretending to be gracious and gentle to all? He'd have to be. But I suppose that, when he has dealt with his exiled enemies by making peace with them and destroying others, so that all is quiet on the front, the first thing he does is stir up a war, so that the people will continue to feel the need of a leader. Probably so. But also so that they'll become poor through having to pay war taxes. And for that way, they'll have to concern themselves with their daily needs and be less likely to plot against him. Clearly. Besides, if he suspects some people of having thoughts of freedom and not favouring his rule, can't he find a pretext for putting them at the mercy of his enemy in order to destroy them? And for all these reasons, is it necessary for a tyrant to always be stirring up war? It is. And because of this, isn't he all the more readily hated by the citizens? Of course. Moreover, doesn't the bravest of those who helped establish his tyranny, and who hold positions of power within it, speak freely to each other, to him, criticizing what's happening? They probably do. Then the tyrant will have to do away with all of them, if he intends to rule, until he's left with neither friend nor enemy of any worth. Clearly. He must therefore keep a sharp lookout for anyone who is brave, large-minded, knowledgeable, or rich. And so, happy is he that he must be the... Page got crumpled. There we go. Happy is he that he must be the enemy of them all, whether he wants to be or not, and plot against them until he has purged them from the city. That's a fine sort of purge. Yes, for it's the opposite of the one that doctors perform on the body. They draw off the worst and leave the best, but he does just the opposite. Yes, I expect he'll have to do this, if he's really going to rule. It's a blessedly happy necessity he's bound by, since it requires him either to live with the inferior majority, even though they hate him, or not to live at all. Yes, that's exactly his condition. And won't he need a larger and more loyal bodyguard the more his actions make the citizens hate him? Of course. And who will these trustworthy people be, and where will he get them? Oh, they'll come swarming in of their own accord, if he pays them. Drones, by the dog, all manner of foreign drones, that's what I think you're talking about. You're right. Well, what about the city itself? Wouldn't he be willing to what? To deprive the citizens of their slaves by freeing them and enlisting them in his bodyguard? He certainly would, since they'd be likely to prove most loyal to him. What a blessedly sort of fellow you make the tyrant out to be. If these sorts of people he employs as friends and loyal followers after he's done away with the earlier ones, nevertheless, they're the sort he employs. And these companions and new citizens admire and associate with him, while the decent people hate and avoid him. Of course. It isn't for nothing, then, that the tragedy in general has the reputation of being... the tragedy in general has the reputation of being wise, and that Euripides is thought to be outstandingly so. Why is that? Because, among other shrewd things, he said that tyrants are wise who associate with the wise, and by the wise, he clearly means the sort of people that we've seen to be the tyrant's associates. Yes, and he and the other poets eulogize tyranny as godlike, and say lots of other things about it. Then surely, since the tragic poets are wise, they'll forgive us, and those whose constitutions resemble ours, if we don't admit them into our city, since they praise tyranny. I suppose the more sophisticated among them will. And so I suppose that they go around to other cities, draw crowds, hire people with fine, big, persuasive voices, and lead their constitutions to tyranny and democracy. They do indeed. And besides, they receive wages and honours, especially, as one might expect, from the tyrants, and in second place, from the democracies. But the higher they go on the ascending scale of democracies, the more their honour falls off, as if unable to keep up with them for lack of breath. Absolutely. But we digress. So let's return to that fine, numerous, diverse, ever-changing bodyguard of the tyrant, and explain how he'll pay for it. Clearly, if there are sacred treasuries in the city, he'll use them for as long as they last, as well as the property of the people he has destroyed, thus requiring smaller taxes from the people. What about when these give out? Clearly, both he and his fellow revellers, his companions, male or female, will have to feed off his father's estate. I understand. You mean that people who have fathered the tyrant will have to feed him and his companions. They'll be forced to do so. And what do you have to say about this? What if the people get angry and say, first, that it isn't just for a grown-up son to be fed by his father, but on the contrary, for the father to be fed by his son. Second, that they didn't father him, especially him in power, so that when he'd become strong, they'd be enslaved to their own share, and have to feed both him and his slaves, along with the other assorted rabble. but because they hoped that, with him as their leader, they'd be free from the rich and the so-called fine, and the good people in the city. Third, that they therefore order him and his companions to leave the city, just as a father might drive a son and his troublesome fellow revellers from his house. Then, by God, the people will come to know what kind of creature they have fathered, welcomed, and made strong, and that they are the weaker, trying to drive out the stronger. What do you mean? Would the tyrant dare to use violence against his father, or to hit him if he doesn't obey? Oh yes, once he's taken away his father's weapon. You mean that the tyrant is a parasite, and harsh nurse of old age? That his father has become an acknowledged tyranny at last, and that, as the saying goes, by trying to avoid the frying pan of enslavement to free men, the people have fallen into the father of having slaves as their masters, and that, in the place of the great but inappropriate freedom they enjoyed under democracy, they have put upon themselves the harshest and most bitter slavery to slaves. That's exactly what I mean. Well then, aren't we justified in saying that we have adequately described how tyranny evolves from democracy and what it's like when it has come into being? We certainly are, he said. And that's the end of Book 8. That was a very on-topic one. Very on-topic. Yeah, these usually have multiple topics, but this one pretty well stuck to the topic. Spoke of sort of the various constitutions and the sort of how they come to be, and then applied that to people, to individuals and their souls. How people can have souls that seem to resemble these kinds of constitutions, and how those come into be, and how one transforms into another. Fun stuff. Ooh, I did that whole one without taking a break this time. I think it was only 25 pages, and I felt my focus wasn't lacking, so I got through the whole thing. But let's go and who should we throw my 4 viewers at? I think I'll throw them at Bonnie Paws. Let's see, raid Bonnie Paws, and now I'm going to wait for the ad to be finished so that I may indulge in seeing people's reactions. Thank you for watching.